Thank you, Ronnie, for inviting me, and I'm so happy to talk about psychedelic plants and their conservation, which is a topic really, really close to my heart. And just a bit about myself. So I have a slightly unusual background because I started off doing biology and then specialized in neuroscience and psychiatry. So I have PhD in psychiatry, and I actually worked in psychiatry research for a number of years. And now I still work to some extent in psychiatry and clinical trials with psychedelics. I am an independent consultant, so I collaborate with King's College London, looking at research with 5-MeO-DMT. But my real passion and the topic that I absolutely love is conservation biology, and I have masters in conservation biology from Imperial College London. And I started there a couple of years ago research on conservation of peyote cactus, and I did field work in Texas and spent several months in Texas, and I'm still very much involved in this field. And in conservation biology, I also member of the Council of Protection of Sacred Plants at Chacruna, and I write articles about conservation of different psychedelics. And I really hope one day these two fields can come into one for me, and I can focus on conservation more. Good time of day, everyone, and it's such a pleasure to present here at Entheogenesis Australis, and I hope soon it will be possible to have in-person gathering. But in these times, still I'm very happy to be able to present even the pre-recorded lecture. And if you have any questions, then feel free to email me as well. I'll have my email address at the end of the slides. So in this talk, I will present 4 case studies of naturally occurring psychedelics and their conservation status, and will shine a spotlight on the darker side of plant medicine use, and hopefully give some ideas on what we could do to help. First of all, I'll start with an introduction about psychedelic ecology. We all know that connection is key to mental health and well-being, and you'll hear more about this fascinating topic from Sam Gandhi, who is also presenting, on whose research this slide is very much based on. We know that psychedelics help to reconnect us to oneself, to others, and to the natural world. They predict pro-environmental behavior and awareness, increase nature relatedness in the long term, and this is mediated by the ego dissolution and experience of awe. And these results are very interesting and important to highlight, yet I think equally important is to look at the other side of the story, where ecological and social vulnerabilities are exposed by the current surge of interest and increase of use in these medicines. More and more people are turning to psychedelics in search of healing, connection, and meaning. We all heard the term psychedelic renaissance and increase in more change in drug policies and everything that comes with it. Yet some practices aimed at therapy, spirituality, or recreation could be endangering to the very plants. All over the world, more and more retreat centers are opening up, promising healing, reconnection to various indigenous lineages using all sorts of psychedelics, like ayahuasca, San Pedro, peyote, that goes together with sweat lodges, meditation, yoga, and all sorts of medical and spiritual promises. Prices range from hundreds to thousands of dollars, and there is more and more coverage of this in the press, and all sorts of celebrities are talking about their psychedelic experiences. So we expect even more people would become more and more interested in psychedelics. But unfortunately, this comes with commercialization, commodification, in many cases, cultural appropriation, and resource extraction. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about conservation status of some of the naturally occurring psychedelics, and think about how can we ensure respectful, safe, ethical, inclusive, and sustainable sourcing of psychedelic plants and materials. And we started exploring these questions earlier this year at the Psychedelic Liberty Summit. And we need to continue raising awareness and offering possible solutions and having a conversation around it. I'll start my case series with the peyote. As I said, this is what I've done my research on and was out there in the deserts in Texas measuring cacti. And of all naturally occurring psychedelics, peyote is without question under most threat. But let's start with a bit of background about this fascinating plant. Peyote is psychoactive cactus mainly found in Texas, USA, and Mexico. Mescaline is the main psychoactive substance there. And mescaline, but not peyote, is listed by a UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs. But both peyote and mescaline are Schedule 1 drugs in the USA. Peyote is a very long-living cactus. It can live 50 or even more years. Actually, no one knows for sure how long it can live. But it has very slow growth and low levels of establishment. That means that if something disrupts the population, it takes very long time, if ever, for plants to recover. And I've seen it with my own eyes in Texas. So if the land was used for agriculture, even 50 years ago, lots of other plants come back, and including cacti, and recolonize the land, but you wouldn't find peyote in this disturbed land. It just takes very long time for it to come back once it's been removed from its natural habitat. And low densities and plants with smaller size reduce possibility of sexual reproduction and lead to a loss of genetic variability, which could be quite dangerous for the species. The latest assessment from the International Union for Conservation of Nature lists this cactus as vulnerable due to ongoing population declines, both in Texas and in Mexico. But in Texas, the situation is more dire. In Texas, it's listed as imperiled or threatened by Nature Reserve, but it's not listed under Endangered Species Act in the USA. And the difference is that Nature Reserve is basically something like IUCN. So they just provide scientific information, while if it's listed under Endangered Species Act, then there is certain conservation actions that are required to happen with this plant. However, listing it under Endangered Species Act might not even do much in practice because it does not apply to plants that grow on private land, and most of Texan peyote grows on private land. In Mexico, peyote is legally protected, and it's in the national list of species at risk of extinction, and it's listed under category subject to special protection. In terms of threats, by far the largest threat to peyote is habitat loss. The land use change includes expansion of agriculture, root plowing led for improved pastures for cattle. That's very common in Texas, where they just remove all the native vegetation, which is Tamaulipan thorn scrub, like lots of thorny bushes like mesquite, cat's claw, and all sorts of Apuntia cacti, and replace it with grasses, non-native grasses, and also overharvesting. However, peyote is not just a wonderful cactus, it's also with psychoactive properties. It's also cultural keystone species. It's sacrament and medicine for many indigenous people whose cultural and spiritual identity depends on continued supply of the sacred cactus. So we need sustainable solutions to not only preserve the species in the wild, but also ensure supply for the vital indigenous traditions. So we need both cultural and ecological sustainability. In the United States, it is estimated that about 250,000-600,000 members of the Native American Church use peyote as a sacrament. And it's very hard to put exact number to those figures in the literature because there are no publicly available records of that, so we don't really know. And Peyote Central Native American Church was officially formed in 1918, and unofficially it was started at the end of 19th century by a very famous Comanche, Connor Parker. And the Native Americans have been fighting for the right to use peyote, and only in 1994, with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, peyote's central role in the Native American Church has been officially recognized in the United States. Yet, since about that time, in the mid-90s, peyote crisis for the Native American Church has really been noted, with the decrease in availability of wild peyote available, difficulty in obtaining peyote, diminishing size of peyote buttons. And it's only been going worse since then. But only recently, in the last 5 years or so, there have been some concrete measures to stop this. And now Native American Church leadership is working on legal pathways to protect and conserve peyote, including culturally acceptable cultivation, repopulation of native habitats, and education by Native Americans. As for Mexico, there are several indigenous groups that still use peyote. It's Tarahumara, Cora, and Virarica, or Huichol. And under Mexican law, only indigenous groups are authorized to harvest and ingest peyote. And likewise, in the United States, only Native Americans are allowed to use peyote, but peyote can be harvested in Texas by anyone who receives a license. So there are several licensed peyote harvesters and distributors who can sell peyote to Native Americans. But going back to Mexico, the Virarica or Huichol are an indigenous people in Mexico that are probably most well known and associated with peyote. The Virarica believe that plant allows them to connect to their ancestors and regenerate their souls. And every year, Virarica communities make a several 100-mile pilgrimage to a sacred site in Virikuta, which is part of Chihuahuan Desert, located in the high plateaus of San Luis Potosi. And this natural protected area is a sacred place and very central to their cosmology. A few years ago, there have been all sorts of fights for the rights of Huichol to this land, and because there have been lots of mining concessions sold to various silver mining companies, and luckily Huichol went to court with it, and there was a big activity to try to stop the mining, and the mining was interrupted with court injunctions. However, other industrial activities continue to actively operate in that area. And researchers and indigenous pilgrims indicate an alarming drop in number of peyote buttons in the natural protected area of Virikuta. And as I said, it's under assault from aggressively expanding agro-industry, water misuse and mismanagement. Also, waste disposal facilities that are planned to be built there, and some are already built. Ever-present threat of mining, because the concessions are still owned by those mining companies, and also peyote tourism. This is probably the center where a lot of people who want to try peyote would go there. Yet, also, this is what we know about Virikuta. That's the probably best researched area in Mexico in terms of peyote populations. but it also grows elsewhere in Chihuahuan Desert, but population dynamics of peyote are unknown, and one of probably the only researchers that have been and seen various populations there was Martin Terry back in 2008, I think, and he also noted population declines and the disappearance of peyote elsewhere. Then I'll move on to the next study of Iboga tree. And I apologize, there is so much information and so much I can talk about each of those plants, and each of those plants could be a separate talk, but I'll have to put lots of information into the short time. So now we move from North America to Africa to look at the Bernante Iboga. It's an evergreen rainforest shrub or a small tree from West Africa. It's central to Bwiti spiritual practices in mainly Gabon, Cameroon, and Republic of Congo. So it's also a cultural keystone species. And the Bwiti use high doses of root bark to tap into spirit realm and contact their ancestors for guidance. And high doses of Iboga are used for initiation ceremonies. And small doses are used in weekly ceremonies in which members of the community come together for Ibogaine has potential for treating addictions to opioids and other substances of abuse. And it's been first championed in the 1960s by Howard Lotsof. After he tried Iboga and it cured him of opioid addiction, he started to promote this method of treatment. And since that time, there are various Iboga therapy centers around the globe, particularly in Mexico. And now there are several clinical trials to assess its effectiveness formally, and there have been several trials in the 90s as well. And even new psychedelic pharma companies are joining in, such as Atai Life Sciences. But of course, all the clinical trials, they use synthetic Ibogaine, not the one from Iboga. But for many of the retreats and the less formal things, still Iboga from Iboga tree is used. In terms of conservation, there are no published ecological assessments or population densities in Gabon or other countries where it grows, such as Congos, Angola, and Cameroon. So we have no idea how much Iboga is there in the forests. But the current consensus is that most of the populations are in Cameroon, in Gabon, sorry. Iboga's fruits attract, among other animals, elephants and gorillas who spread the plant's seed. And as these animals dwindle due to hunting and deforestation, we lose not only them, but also an important step in the life cycle of Iboga. IUCN lists Iboga as least concern due to wide distribution and supposedly large population, but as I said, we don't know how large those populations are because no one has gone there and looked at the populations. In Gabon, Iboga is declared a national treasure, a cultural heritage strategic reserve, and it's illegal to export wild harvested Iboga out of Gabon. And it's governed by several laws, convention on biodiversity, laws for protection of cultural goods, and the Nagoya Protocol. However, reports from Gabon indicate local shortages where even the Bwiti have to pay a lot for the root bark, and which used to be easily foraged in the wild. And there are several drivers of of those shortages of Iboga in Gabon. And I get this information from 3 key reports. One is a report to Gabonese government, which leads to banning the export of Iboga in 2019. And more recently, 3 reports made by ICERs, where they've done interviews with the both global Ibogaine community in terms of where does Ibogaine is coming from, but also did a lot of interviews with the local people in Gabon, the Viti practitioners, local communities, and researchers about the situation there on the ground. So synthesizing the information in this report, there are several drivers that lead to shortages. One is increased global demand in consumption and the production of its extracts. However, Ibogaine produced from alternative sources is currently available, and I'll talk more about this later. Another threat to Iboga is evangelical influence from Christian and Islamic missionaries that traditionally marginalized Viti practitioners and could possibly alienated political or financial support that could be used for preservation and maybe even cultivation programs. There is, of course, climate change, and the rainy seasons in Gabon have become shorter and temperature has increased, providing climatic stress on entire rainforest ecosystem. And again, nobody studied it in the context of Iboga. And even though Gabon has very high forest coverage and 17% of Gabonese land mass is protected in a large system of national parks, but there are still other areas where there is logging and logging concessions, and of course there is a lot of poaching happening in national parks as well. Another problem is police seizing domestic shipments, and this is relevant because most of the population, Gabonese population, is urban and is actually centered in Libreville and other big cities, but many still depend on wild collected forest resources. So one of those factors is that police is seizing Iboga shipments before they can get to local markets, and then where those shipments go, who knows. Next factor is organized crime and black market dynamics. Elephants and monkeys which distribute Iboga seeds in the wild are often poached, their populations are threatened, and there is some rumors that Iboga is also harvested by ivory poachers, and it's could be similar smuggling routes to the black market. But again, this is something that's rumored. There is no published research on that. And there is also lack of traditional agriculture, and cultivation programs are just starting because traditionally Iboga was always harvested from the forest. It's been there and available. And there was some Ibogas planted around the houses maybe, but again, not enough to satisfy demand. Currently, also another problems is that there is currently no system for product traceability. So once you get Ibogaine or Iboga, it's impossible to find out whether it's coming from plantation or it's been harvested from the wild, whether it's been poached in Gabon, transported to Cameroon and sold from there, where there are no regulations on selling Iboga. Unlike in Gabon, there is networks of organized crime and also prohibition stops being able to put all those systems in place, and also bureaucracy and corruption in Gabon and neighboring countries. Now I'm moving on to the next case study of Sonoran Desert toad. called Entheogenesis, or as it's a lot more commonly known, Bufo alvarius. It's been renamed in about 12 years ago, but still many people call it Bufo. And as the name suggests, it lives in Sonoran Desert, and it's the largest toad living in the United States and very long living. And you can see in this photograph from National Geographic this magnificent toad. And you can see also these glands called parotoid glands that secrete milky substance that protects, and there are also some glands on its legs that secrete milky substance protecting toad from predators. And in this toad secretions, there is 5-MeO-DMT, bufotenin, and various toxins. There are lots and lots of components in bufotoxin. 5-MeO-DMT is one of the most potent psychedelics, and in the last few years has risen in popularity in a variety of ceremonial and recreational settings. Not all 5-MeO-DMT used ceremonially is from the toad. It can be synthesized, and it's a lot easier to synthesize it compared to Ibogaine, for example. But still many people think that natural thing is better and prefer to use toad secretions. Even though 5-MeO-DMT is still the main psychoactive component. In terms of conservation, the IUCN lists the toad as the least concerned, but the latest assessment was done in 2004, and a lot of things have changed since then. And the toad is found in Mexico, in the Sonoran Desert, and in the United States in California, Arizona, and New Mexico. And the local, there have been no data from Mexico, no population assessments, but populations assessment in the United States indicate that in California, this toad has not been seen for many, many decades, and it's likely extirpated from California. And it's also declining in New Mexico and considered vulnerable in Arizona. There are many reasons for this. Toads and generally amphibians in general are very sensitive for environmental problems, for pesticides and contamination in the rivers and loss of habitat. Also in the last, there has been particularly notorious pathogen devastating amphibian populations worldwide, which is called chytrid fungus. And it has already wiped out 90 species entirely and caused drastic population decline in 500 more species. And this has been going on all across the world. This chytrid fungus has been really, really big disaster for all the amphibians. And there has been the first case noted in 2014 of Entheogenesis alvarius in Arizona tested positive for chytrid. Luckily for Sonoran Desert toad, chytrid is not deadly, but it's still for this particular species. But it still weakens its immune system and resilience to all the other threats that it faces. In terms of practices of getting the toxins from the toad, it's supposedly sustainable resource where you can get the toad, depress its glands, and then release the toads back. But it's still a very stressful event for the toad, and it can stress can negatively influence reproduction, immune function, and growth. It's also a lot easier to spread pathogens like that, particularly if toads from different locations are caught and combined together. This could facilitate the spread of pathogens. And also, if it's done at a very large scale, as I've seen some pictures from social media, and Robert Villa from Tuscan Herpetological Society has shared as well. You can see these toads with highly vascularized glands. I can see lots of blood vessels, and that indicates that the gland has been pressed many times. So the toad has been probably repeatedly picked up for harvesting the secretions. And you can see, like, on social media advertised huge amounts of toad secretions, and I don't know how many hundreds of toads it takes to produce that much gland secretions to sell it. So definitely in Mexico, this extraction is happening at a very large scale. And very often the way it's done is that somebody goes with the truck, collects the toads along the road, because they often can be found along the roads because they're attracted by the lights that attract the insects that toad feeds on. And lots of toads are collected, combined together, then their secretions are harvested, and then they're released somewhere else, not from where they were picked up. It's also important to note that there is no evidence about from archaeological, literary, or ethnographic sources of the indigenous use of these toads for their psychoactive properties. And the current toad medicine circles are thought to be a relatively recent phenomenon, tracing its origin to publication of a booklet, Bufo Alvarez, Psychedelic Toad of the Sonoran Desert, in 1984. There have been one of the episodes of Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia in the recent season, where he found the author of this, where Hamilton Morris found the author of this booklet. However, there are some indigenous groups in Mexico now that started to use toad in their ceremonies, but this is more recent revival of the as I said, there is no historical evidence for a long time use of the toads. And then moving on to my last case study, which is ayahuasca wine. Ayahuasca is a brew consisting of mixture of plants containing psychoactive DMT and harmala alkaloids. And in this brew, harmine and harmaline act as monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which neutralize an enzyme which breaks down DMT, the main psychoactive ingredient in ayahuasca. So it can pass to bloodstream and ultimately to the brain and have its psychoactive effect. For this case study, I'll focus on caapi wine, which is also called ayahuasca wine. And this is just one part of the ayahuasca brew, the one that has harmala alkaloids. And I focus on this plant because traditionally it's considered the spirit of ayahuasca, and it's present in most traditional preparations and also in the preparations by the various syncretic churches in Brazil, like UDV and Santo Daime. However, ayahuasca can be made from any combination of other plants that have those two ingredients that I mentioned, and also additional psychoactive plants such as Nicotiana rustica, which is a type of tobacco, or Brugmansia, or even Datura can be sometimes added, even though it's a lot less common. Caapi, Banisteriopsis caapi is a jungle vine or liana. It grows, it's a fairly fast growing, but it still takes about 5 to 10 years to grow to maturity. And it's widespread all across Amazonian forests and biome. It's not assessed by IUCN. And in terms of the regulations, Brazil is the only country that has regulation on the ayahuasca extraction, harvesting, and export. And in the last few years, there have been lots of talk about sustainability of ayahuasca and the questions, are we running out of ayahuasca wine? And so I wanted to include this just to clear out some misconceptions. And there have also been some reports from ayahuasca centers in Peru, for example, Iquitos. And the locals, they report that they have to go further and further to find lianas in the wild state, which is sometimes preferred. And also the thickness of arriving vines has decreased substantially. However, there are also reports that rather than harvest in the wild, many started to cultivate their own ayahuasca vines and also psychotria. And this has been going on for at least 10 years or so. Some of those cultivation centers are fairly old, although they're still not large enough to satisfy the supply. And in Brazil, ayahuasca has been cultivated and harvested in various states to satisfy demand from the syncretic religions. And even though, because ayahuasca is available on cultivation and is cultivated, and all the reports so far indicate that it's just the local shortages around Iquitos, while there are no such reports from elsewhere, from Ecuador, from Colombia, where it grows. It still seems abundant. But so I think it's, at least with the data that we have now, we can conclude that Synopsis caapi is not in danger throughout most of the Amazon, at least not from overharvesting for ayahuasca. However, there are other things that we need to zoom out and see. We shouldn't lose sight of the forest for the vines. And the biggest threat for ayahuasca is global destruction of the Amazon rainforest. And it's a huge problem with lots of both legal and particularly illegal logging, particularly during COVID. And with the current Bolsonaro administration in Brazil, the situation is getting worse. And this deforestation is driven by the spread of cattle ranching, soy plantations, mining, and other forms of development. So we need to pay attention to what's happening in ayahuasca native areas, support the effort of indigenous people to protect the Amazon, and find alternative models not based on resource extraction. And it's very easy to think that if somebody goes to retreat of ayahuasca and the retreat advertises, okay, we have sustainable ayahuasca, to feel good about it. But if one is eating lots of beef and just thinking of the more global scale than a one-off thing as ayahuasca consumption. And another thing that one alarming research that came to my attention is that ayahuasca tourism boom could be an undervalued driver for jaguar body parts. And in this researchers, through discussion with street vendors, shamans, and individuals working in tourism industry in Peru, researchers found that jaguar teeth or skin and other jaguar products are being sold to tourists under pretense that they somehow enhance ayahuasca experience. So there could be other consequences of ayahuasca tourism rather than directly affecting the availability of the wine. So to summarize, moving on to the next question, are there ethical and sustainable alternatives? The answer very much depends on one's worldview, belief system, culture, traditions, values, and the intention for consuming psychedelic substance. For example, it would be highly unethical to suggest replacing sacrament central to one's spiritual belief with another plant. On the other hand, for Ludibond users, there are plenty of options, for example, synthetic sources or other plants that I will talk about in a second. And in terms of, aside from the issues of ethics and sustainability, many people wonder whether subjective effects would be the same between, for example, Peyotes and Pedro or pure mescaline, or between the toad secretions and 5-MeO-DMT. And many people report that the effects are not. And one of the scientific explanations for this is the entourage effect, where other alkaloids could influence the effect experienced from the main psychoactive component. But again, this is something that's not really well researched or studied in the context of psychedelics. The entourage effect is better studied in cannabis. But it's also not all doom and gloom. There are lots of psychoactive plants that are doing really well in the wild. Many psychoactive mushrooms thrive in the areas of human disturbance. For example, pasture-loving liberty cups and cubensis and paniolus species that really spread with the cattle ranching. And also, there are lots of psychedelic species that are considered invasive species once they moved out of their natural range. For example, DMT-rich plants such as mimosa and certain acacias, and plants like Syrian rue, which are considered highly invasive in the United States, that contain harmala alkaloids. And also many plants grow really well in cultivation, such as San Pedro cacti, morning glories, Hawaiian baby wood rose, or even salvia. And salvia is actually an interesting one here because in the wild it's found in Oaxaca mountains, and the populations there are quite small, but it's been widely available in cultivation, and nobody talks about going to Mexico to poach salvia from there because you can just so easily get it elsewhere. So in terms of mescaline-containing cacti, there are Echinopsis or Trichocereus species, and these cacti are really fast growing and very abundant in the wild, both in the wild and in cultivation. And in terms of Ibogaine-containing plants, there is Voacanga africana, which is a tree closely related to Iboga that grows more quickly and in a range of different climates, making it more sustainable option. It's also is in cultivation because it has other alkaloids other than Voacangine that are used medically. And its fruits are edible and eaten in certain parts of Africa. And there is a way to get Iboga from Voacangine using a semi-synthesis method that's fairly easy. And there are also several species of genus Tabernamontana that have been found to contain indole alkaloids, including Ibogaine and Voacangine. And there are at least 4 species of Tabernamontana in Mexico that have Ibogaine. So this is one of the several alternatives for harvesting Iboga root bark. And there are also so many plants that contain DMT and 5-MeO-DMT. DMT is one of the most common alkaloids found in nature, and it's found in lots of acacia species, as you all know from the Australia, and also other species across the world. So in conclusion, I would like to draw parallels between psychospiritual balance and ecological balance. And part of taking psychedelics is opening your mind and becoming more aware of various issues and more conscientious about asking questions: where does the plant or toad medicine coming from? What impact it has for other people, whether it's the environment or indigenous people. And in the ongoing psychedelic renaissance, psychedelics bring so much hope and promise and healing and connection, and but we also need to expand our consciousness, political and cultural and ecological realities. These plants are and animals are part of the whole ecosystem. It's not just a plant. It's something that has been here as a part of ecological and cultural landscape, going back in history for thousands of years. So we need to respect and protect this and support efforts aimed at conservation and restoration, and support indigenous people that's been looking after the land as well. And this is so important all across the world, not just the Amazon. We need to think from sustainability and reciprocity principle, give back to local communities, and where possible, grow your own or substitute for more sustainable options. And this is just a quick run through various resources and organizations that you could support for. In terms of indigenous reciprocity, and all sorts of reports confirm that indigenous people are exceptionally good at protecting biodiversity in their territories. And over 80% of the world's biodiversity resides inside traditional indigenous territories. And here there are several organizations you could contribute to and support that give back directly to the communities. And for peyote, organizations like Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative that engages in many strategies of restoration of peyote, Cactus Conservation Institute that has been at the forefront of peyote conservation for the last 20 years, Virarica Research Center, Nierica in Mexico, that work with the Huichol people. For Iboga, it's an organization called Blessings of the Forest that works in Gabon. For Sonoran Desert, though, Tuscan Herpetological Society, Coalition for Sonoran Desert, several projects to ayahuasca, and also all sorts of organizations and NGOs for the Amazon conservation. And on this note, I'll finish my study, and I'm looking forward for the questions. And please feel free to email me any other questions as well. I'll be happy to answer. First of all, I have to say that I'm a lot more familiar with the situation in the United States rather than Mexico. So I would not be able to answer like what is the spectrum of opinions in Mexico about it. But I know in the United States that even the Native American Church is not a one centralized organization. There are different branches and different chapters of it, and lots of different groups of indigenous people are members of it, so they don't speak with a unified voice as well. So there is a variety of opinions, even amongst the Native American Church. But there are, as you said, there are lots of other groups that practice peyote religion that, for one reason or another, do not have federally recognized status in the United States, but they still practice peyote religion and use it. And sometimes they get in conflict with the Native American church as well, who don't recognize their rights to use peyote. And there are also various debates whether it's possible to include non-Indigenous people in the peyote meetings and churches, and there is a variety of opinions about that as well. So there are lots of controversies with peyote in particular that came to light with the recent debates about decriminalization, and it became a very, very heated discussion and brought to light many of those conflicts. And yes, there are some amongst the Native Americans who believe that you shouldn't cultivate peyote because peyote is better living in the wild, and cultivating it will reduce the potency of the medicine, and it shouldn't be cultivated. Yet there are some groups that really want to cultivate because it would provide them independence from the peyote harvesters and dealers and allow them to be more self-sufficient. And there are several groups that are already starting cultivation projects in addition to IPCI, such as, for example, Comanche are planning to start a greenhouse, and I know of others that are cultivating. So, and then there are people who think that you generally shouldn't interfere with peyote because it will look after itself as it has been looking after for thousands of years and growing. I personally disagree with it because it would have been looking after itself, but unfortunately there are so many anthropogenic pressures on the land itself, and so much less land for it to grow that at how it goes and the trends that we can see, it's not going to look after itself. It really needs our help, I think. But for this to happen, it's really important that we have the collaboration of all the stakeholders involved, particularly Native American community, and also the landowners on whose land it grows. In the context of Iboga, in terms of IP, I generally don't know that much about intellectual property rights and all the legal issues around it, because I'm more of either biology or the neuroscience. So I might not be the best person to answer all the legal questions about intellectual property and stuff. But I know there has been a lot of conversations now about the Nagoya Protocol and whether it's a good way of giving back to native communities who hold the traditional knowledge about these plants, and what sort of systems can be built in. Is it possible to build into maybe supplement the Nagoya protocols? And I know there have been several IP laws around ayahuasca in the 80s and recently as well. I'm not that familiar with the Iboga. Yeah, this is a very, very, very important issue, and this is something that very very hard to. There is no good easy answer to this question. This is something I think that we as a psychedelic community, and even wider as well, all those debates go way beyond psychedelic community about how to navigate those issues. Like, for example, one of the classic examples with the indigenous knowledge holders is the case of Hudia, which is a succulent from Africa, and that's was marketed as an appetite as a medicine by pharmaceutical companies, and how they have been setting up agreements with the San people about benefit sharing and debates around it, who to include, what communities, how does this benefit sharing work in practice. And I think there is something we can learn from that case and possibly apply to psychedelics. But again, a lot of those things are not easily defined. Like, for example, in the case of Iboga, indigenous communities that can be included would be the pygmies, but also the Viti practitioners. But then the Viti practitioners can come from different ethnic groups. And do we just include Viti practitioners from Gabon or also Cameroon? And what if they are from Gabon and then moved to some other countries? Like, how do you who do you include in those agreements, and how do you set those questions, set those up is a good question. And also in terms of commercial production, a lot of companies that develop psychedelics, what they could say is that we use synthetics. It has nothing to do with the plant. So they could say, well, if it's done in the lab, why should we share? But I think it is important to acknowledge the lineages and indigenous people that use it. But again, how to formalize it, I don't know. There are some discussions about labeling and certification of Iboga, for example, if it's produced in cultivation and then sold, so something that can be traced back that, okay, this Iboga has been produced in cultivation and this Iboga is probably coming wild harvested or poached. So yeah, there are some movement in this regard in terms of labeling, but of course, as you said, it could be just another layer of administration that could be circumvented. But I think it's also very important to address the issues of prohibition, because under prohibition, it's a lot harder to make this certification schemes and labeling, because if it is a legal substance, how do you enforce that? It all has to be voluntary, and has to be voluntary both from the consumers and the suppliers. And you can address it to some extent with education, but there is like no other way to make sure that people would adhere or even use these schemes. So in terms of false peyotes, they're not really that widely used. They sometimes mistakenly collected they're sometimes mistaken for peyote, but they're not under such harvesting pressure as peyote itself. And I wanted to say about Astrophytum asterius, which is listed as under Endangered Species Act. So yeah, I wanted to mention that. And once it's listed under Endangered Species Act, there is conservation action plans for it, and all sorts of. There is more protection for it. But also the problem with Astrophytum is not just that it's sometimes mistaken for peyote and harvested. this actually doesn't happen often because a lot of harvesting is done by professional pickers who can definitely tell peyote apart from astrophytum. But astrophytum has it's a lot more picky about its habitat requirements. It grows only on certain soils, and the problem again, the land use change, there is less and less land for it to grow. So for it, the problem of habitat loss is a lot more pressing, even for peyote, which is a bit more hardy plant. I guess get the information out, write articles, talk at various events and conferences, post on the forums the information about it. So basically just educate people, because a lot of I personally very much believe that people, once there is information, a lot of people are able to form their opinions if they know about it. That's the first thing, is to raise awareness. Of course, that might not be enough for some people, because there are many prior beliefs that could influence it. As I said, for example, lots of people believe that natural is better, or maybe wild grown is better. But at least education is the very, very first step in addressing those questions. Well, currently it has less protection, unless you count the fact that it's Schedule 1 drug as a protection, which some people think is sufficient protection for it. Yeah, it's not listed under Endangered Species Act in the United States. It has some environmental protection in Mexico, but again, it doesn't stop expansion of agribusinesses and various development in the territory where it grows. And again, the problem in the United States is that peyote grows almost exclusively on private land. And the law in the United States is set in that way that a lot of environmental protection applies to animals that live on private land, but not really to plants. So people are still free to do whatever they want with their land. And in Texas, it's like most of it is private land, and most of peyote habitat is private land. Yeah, it's a very interesting system in the United States that some people can harvest peyote, and you have to apply for a special license. And once you get this license, which is not very easy to get, but it's possible, and it costs also several thousands of dollars to get this license. But once you get this license and also enter in the agreements with the landowners who own the land to harvest peyote, then peyote is harvested by the licensed distributors, and it's the distributors that sell peyote to the Native Americans. So that's the system in place. And there are also a lot of issues about poaching in Texas. And there is some people raise concern that a lot of poaching is coming from just recreational users who come to Texas for poaching. But just seeing the situation there, it looks like most of the poaching is happening by the pickers that are employed by the distributors, because first of all, they know the land very well, and a lot of poaching is happening on the territories adjacent to the land where there are licenses to harvest peyote as well. And also, peyote is really not easy to find in Texas. It's you really have to have a good local knowledge where it's found. And once peyote ends up on the local, on the distributor's drying racks, it's very hard to know where it's come from, whether it's been poached or not. So it's basically an issue of how is going to find out. And another reason why I think that poaching by recreational users is not as common, like of course it happens, but it's not as common as it is sometimes portrayed, is that it's quite dangerous in Texas to trespass on other people's land. And there are lots of gun-carrying people who are very protective of their land. And they already have issues with trespassing, with all the immigration that's coming from Mexico. And a lot of landowners are very sensitive about any sort of issues of trespassing. So it is quite dangerous for somebody who's never been there to just, jump the fence and go harvest peyote on somebody's land. And in practice, most of the people who want to try peyote recreationally can just go to Mexico, where it's very easily available in the local markets. And there are lots of, like, you can just either buy it yourself, or there are even safaris going to Chihuahuan Desert where you can harvest your own peyote. Of course, all of this is illegal, but it's the enforcement is not quite there. Ayahuasca tourism is a lot more common. Again, it's hard to estimate exactly the numbers, but for Peru, which is particular center for ayahuasca tourism, it's probably like several thousands of people a year that go for retreat centers there, and there are probably more that maybe don't go to official retreat centers. And then there are centers also in Colombia, in Ecuador, and Brazil as well. So this and in with ayahuasca, it's also legal in those countries. So a lot of those things happen above ground, so it's a lot easier to quantify. For peyote, nobody can quantify that. Yeah, I would estimate that it's a lot less than ayahuasca, but it's still happening in Mexico.
Yeah.
Probably not anytime soon. Given our Western materialistic worldview, I don't think that would see it a UN representative for peyote.
Damn.
I'd love to see it, and there are also some discussions, and some of them are actually led by the Indigenous people about the personhood for maybe rivers or mountains. No, if a corporation can be legally considered a person, why not a forest or a mountain? And it would make sense to offer rights and protections, actually a lot more sense than offering rights and protections to a corporation. But yeah, I don't think we are there yet. Also, how do you know that people represent the interest of the plant and not their own ego? That's saying I've seen so many people who get those missions, like, I don't know, ayahuasca told me to do that, but is it ayahuasca really? Is it their own inner voice? I don't know. For people stuck in the city, I would recommend, first of all, supporting various organizations that do good work for protecting those plants, and ideally supporting more grassroots, smaller organizations that are led by the local or indigenous people and the communities. And also support the efforts for the whole ecosystem protection. So to not just focus on the plants, but to focus on the whole biome, because plants don't exist in isolation, and you can work on saving, I don't know, ayahuasca or Iboga, but then if the whole forest disappears, and all the animals and all the subtle ecological links that exist between plants and animals and everyone as a whole. So I think it's very, very important to protect the whole of the ecosystem, not just to focus on plants. And I would also encourage, wherever it's legally possible, to grow your own. Oh, wow, that's a good question. I would start with well, again, my own bias as a biologist and the training that I have and the impact that I could personally make for me. So my strength is more in using some sort of biological or ecological assessments. So I would go and actually find out what's the in terms of psychedelic plants or substances. I would first of all want to know what's the situation with the plants in the wild, and do population studies and assessments of harvesting. But yeah, again, that's my own bias. So I know very much the importance of working with the communities and doing not just biology, but all sorts of anthropological and social sciences research, and very, very, very important aspects of changing the current systems of prohibition and drug policy. So yeah, I would find some people who are good in those areas and maybe legal areas as well, to trying to figure out those. And I personally would go out and into the forest and count plants. Well, you cannot answer this question without mentioning Richard Evans Schultes, was the great ethnobotanist, and also his students Wade Davis and Tim Plowman, and Mark Plotkin as well. So they all have wonderful books. And I also really, really like Encyclopedia of Psychoactive Plants by Christian Raj. There's such a resource, like repository of knowledge. There's just so much information there. Yeah.